Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
We are from Group 1,
Tefl 1, class 4A. My name is Nurul Fakhraina. My name is Sarah Afifa. My name is Dini Nazara Ramadania.
my name is Farah Anina.
We are going to explain you about teaching methods. Let's jump into.
Grammar translation method. At one time, the grammar translation method was called the classical method. Early 15th, Latin was the most widely studied foreign language due to its importance in government, academia, and business. The purposes of grammar translation method are helping students read and appreciate foreign language literature. Students would become more familiar with the grammar of the target language. Would help students grow intellectually, to read and translate literature, and to boost students' general intellectual development through the analysis of complex grammatical structures. The rules of grammar translation method: teacher is always talking, explaining the material in the chapter, and correcting students' translation. For students, just asking and answering the questions from teacher. The principles of grammar translation method. The first, conducted in students' native language. The second, learn grammar rules by rote. The third, more attention is paid to the form than content of the sentences translated. The fourth, not usually any listening or speaking practice. The fifth, very little attention on pronunciation or any communicative aspects of the language. The sixth, focus is reading in the context translation. The next, the techniques of grammar translation method. Begin with reading and analyzing grammatically. Reading comprehension questions. Writing sentences or composition. Doing grammar drills. Translating sentences to and from target language. Memorization. Fill in the blanks. And antonym or synonym.
The Reform Movement. From the 1880s centuries, linguists such as Henry Sweet, Wilhelm Vieta, and Paul Passy began to provide the intellectual leadership needed to give reformist idea greater credibility and acceptance. Linguists emphasized that speech, rather than the written word, was the primary form of language. The International Phonetic Association was founded by Paul Passy in 1886. International Phonetic Alphabet, or EPA, was designed to enable the sound of any language to be accurately transcribed. One of the earliest goals to association was to improve the teaching of modern language. It advocates 1. The study of the spoken language. 2. Phonetic training in order to establish good pronunciation habits. 3. The use of conversation texts and dialogues to introduce conversational phrases and idioms. 4. An inductive approach to the teaching of grammar. 5. Teaching new meanings through establishing association within the target language rather than by establishing association with the native language. Henry Sweet set 4 principles for the development of teaching methods in his book, The Practical Study of Language. These include 1. Careful selection of what is to be taught. 2. imposing limits on what is to be taught. 3. Arranging what is to be taught in terms of the four skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. 4th, grading materials from simple to complex. Sweet, Vieta, Passy, and other reformers in the late 19th century share many beliefs about the principle on which a new approach to teaching foreign language should be based. In general, the reformers believed that 1. The spoken language is primary and should be reflected in an oral-based methodology. 2. The findings of phonetics should be applied to teaching and to teacher trainings. 3. Learners should hear the language first, before seeing it in written form. 4. Words should be presented in sentences, and sentences should be practiced in meaningful context and not to be taught as isolated, disconnected elements. 5. The rules of grammar should be taught only after the student have practiced the grammar points in context. That is, grammar should be taught inductively. 6. Translation should be avoided, although the native language could be used in order to explain new words or to check comprehension.
The natural approach. The natural approach developed by Tracy Terrell and supported by Stephen Krashen. It is a language teaching approach which claims that language learning is a reproduction of the way humans naturally acquire their native language. Krashen and Terrell view communication as the primary function of language and adhere to a communicative approach to language teaching, focusing on a teaching communicative abilities rather than sterile language structures. It is premises concerning the use of language and the importance of vocabulary. Language is viewed as a vehicle for communicating meaning and messages, while vocabulary is of paramount importance as language is essentially its lexicon. Krashen grounded the natural approach on a number of learning tenets. First is the acquisition learning hypothesis. Krashen makes a distinction between acquisition and learning. Acquisition as a developing competence by using language for real communication. It is a natural way of developing ability to speak a language, reverse to an unconscious process using language for meaningful communication. And learning refers to the formal study of language rules and is a conscious process. The second is the monitor hypothesis. It states that we may use learned knowledge to correct ourselves when we communicate, but that the conscious learning has only this function. Learners tend to think about language or grammar rules, correctness, and form before giving output. They will even monitor their language to the point that they might even interrupt what they are saying. The third is the natural order hypothesis. Its hypothesis states that language or linguistic structures tend to be learned naturally in a relatively predictable order. So, some structures tend to be learned very early in the language learning process, while other more complex or difficult structures tend to be learned much later in the overall language learning process. For example, present tense will be learned by most language students much earlier than continuous and past tense. The fourth is the input hypothesis. This is the formula L+1. L is for the natural order or mother tongue, and 1 is for the target language. Krashen describes these in terms of type of input the learner receives. Input must be comprehensible, slightly above the learner's present level of competence, interesting or relevant, not grammatically sequenced, in sufficient quantity, and experience it low anxiety context. Broadly tuned, relaxed, and low anxiety. The last is the effective filter hypothesis. This hypothesis states that how open or receptive a learner is to language input or stimulus is determined by mental screening of language elements. There are
three types of emotional factors that may affect acquisition. These are motivation, self-confidence, and anxiety. Acquirers with high affective filters are less likely to develop competence.
The direct method. The direct method, or also known as the natural method, started with Francois Goin and was picked up later by Berlitz and Safo in the 19th century. Since the GTM was not very effective in preparing students to use the target language communicatively, the direct method became popular. The direct method has one very basic rule, which is no translation is allowed. In fact, the direct method received its name from the fact that meaning is to be conveyed directly in the target language through the use of demonstration and visual aids with no resource to the student's native language. What are the goals of teachers who use the direct method? Teachers who use this method intend that students learn how to communicate in the target language. And what is the role of the teachers? What is the role of the students? Although the teacher directs the class activities, the student role is less passive than in the grammar translation method. How is language viewed, and how is culture viewed? Language is primarily spoken, not written. Therefore, students study common everyday speech in the target language. They also study culture consisting of the history of the people who speak the target language. Learning process. Teachers who use this method believe that students need to associate meaning with the target language directly. So, when the teacher introduces a new target language word or phrase, he demonstrates its meaning through the use of realia, pictures, or pantomime, and he never translates it into the student's native language. What are areas of language are emphasized? What language skills are emphasized? Vocabulary is emphasized over grammar. Although work on all four skills occurs from the start, oral communication is seen as basic. Lastly, the principles and the procedures. First, the classroom instructions are conducted exclusively in the target language. Second, only everyday vocabulary and sentences are taught. Third, oral communication skills were built up in carefully graded progression organized around question and answer exchange between teachers and students in well-intensive class. Fourth, grammar was taught inductively. Fifth, new teaching points were introduced orally. Sixth, concentrate vocabulary was taught by association of ideas. Seventh, both speaking and listening comprehension was taught. And eighth, correct pronunciation and grammar were emphasized. The Berlitz method. This method was brought to the U.S. by a German named Maximilian Berlitz who migrated to the U.S. in the 1878, and he became a professor of French and German. One day, he fell ill and a Frenchman called Nicolas came to take over his courses, but turned out Nicolas cannot speak English, so he instructed him to use gesture in order to get his message across, and Nicolas only used the target language while teaching. This method turned out to be effective in language teaching. The techniques. The first one is reading aloud. Students take turns reading sections of passage, play, or dialogue out loud. At the end of each student's turn, the teacher uses gestures, pictures, realia, examples, or other means to make the meaning of the section clear. Question and answer. This exercise is conducted only in the target language. Students are asked question and answer in full sentences so that they practice new words and grammatical structures. They have the opportunity to ask questions as well as answer them. Getting students to self-correct. The teacher of this class has the students self-correct by asking them to make a choice between what they said and an alternative answer he applied. Conversation practice. The teacher asks students a number of questions in the target language, which they have to understand to be able to answer correctly. The questions contain a particular grammar structure. Later, the students were able to ask each other their own questions using the same grammatical structure. Fill in the blanks exercise. The students will have induced the grammar rule they need to fill in the blanks from examples and practice with earlier parts of the lesson. Dictation. The teacher reads the passage 3 times. The first time the teacher reads it at a normal speed, while the student just listens. The second time he reads the passage phrase by phrase, pausing long enough to allow students to write down what they have heard. the last time the teacher again reads at the normal speech and the students check their work. Map drawing. The students were given a map with the geographical feature unnamed. Then the teacher gave instructions for all the geographical features of the United States so that students would have a completely labeled map if they followed his instructions correctly. The students then instructed the teacher to do the same thing with a map he had drawn on the board. Paragraph writing. The teacher in this class asked the students to write a paragraph in their own words. They could have done this from memory, or they could have used the reading passage in the lesson as a model.
Thank you for watching.
We hope this video will help for you.
And don't forget to give your time for us.
Comment.
And forget to subscribe.
Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.